webinar, Rail Logistics and the Silk Route. My name is Margherita. I am the head of CEIBS Alumni Italy chapter, which is also the organizer of today's webinar. So a couple of logistic information for you. First, the webinar is being live streamed on YouTube, which means that in case you miss anything during today's webinar, you will be able to watch it again on our YouTube channel, and we will take care of sending the link to the recording to the email addresses that you have provided during your registration. And second piece of information, you will be able to ask questions to our panelists. Please do use the chat box, the Q&A box that you find at the bottom of your screen. So just write your questions there, and we will try to pick up all of the questions and address them to our panelists, maybe during the Q&A session towards the end of today's webinar. Now, without further ado, let me introduce you to today's panelists. Professor Liang Chao, Assistant Professor of Operation Management at CEIBS. Welcome, Professor. Now we have Mr. Emanuele Bender, Managing Director of Deutsche Bahn Cargo, DB Cargo Italy, as well as one of our CEIBS alumni. So welcome, Emanuele. And Mrs. Tabea Klang, who is the Chief Sales Officer at DB Cargo Eurasia. Welcome, Tabea. So I think I'm done with all the information for today. I hope everyone enjoys, and Professor Liang, the floor is yours.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. I would like to spend a few minutes to give a brief introduction about the background and about the topic today. Okay. First, I want to show you this figure. You must have heard about the One Belt, One Route. Okay, you can see China has signed more than 200 cooperation documents on the Belt and Road Initiative with around 150 countries and 32 international organizations. If you look at this, including two parts.
Sorry, Professor Liang, please share the screen again, because I think we cannot see it.
Okay, see. Okay, then. Can you see it now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. First, I want to show you this figure. You can see here. I think many of you might have heard about this One Belt, One Route. China has signed more than 200 cooperation documents on the Belt and Road Initiative with 147 countries and 32 international organizations. If you look at here, you can see mainly includes two parts. First is this part is over the land, and second is this part, okay, over the sea. And today our talk is mainly focused on this part, that's the land, the rail logistics from the between China and Europe. See here. I want to hear some number. You see here is the number of blockchains between China and Europe. Okay, this is including Russia and this excluding Russia. You can see here the Belt and Road Initiative starting from 2013. Here, starting from here, you can see since 2013, the number of blockchains increased very, very fast. Okay, and here is it. I give the number until 2018. You can see it's increased a dramatic rise since the start of this initiative. And the physical connectivity and trade are prioritized by this initiative along with other aspects. You can see here, this is a blockchain, and After that, we'll see we will have the COVID-19. Many of you might think because the COVID-19, because the prevention and control, all kinds of these measurements, the number of blockchains or the volume will decrease, will be greatly blocked. But you can see, on the contrary, you can see the opposite. You can see even with the COVID-19, the number of the freight chains keep increasing. You can see here. Okay, this is 2019, 2020 is keep increasing. So we can call it against the trend of epidemic. And during the epidemic period, the China-Europe chain delivered 9.39 million pieces medical supplies. Okay, so someone call it a life channel because it deliver a lot of medical supplies from Europe, from the China to the Europe. And also it play an important role of the industry chain. Okay, so by the end of 2020, more than 33,000 China-Europe trains have been operated in total, reaching more than 90 cities in more than 20 countries. Also, is this this China-Europe train help promote this cross-border e-commerce. For example, in November 2020, we have the first special train carry cross-border e-commerce pursuit with a total value of this US 1.44 million from the Yiwu to Belgium and then to the many other countries. You can see here is facilitated the transportation, the cross-border e-commerce. When we put the railway transportation with the other two transportation mode, that is sea and air, you can see in terms of both, in terms of the value and the volume, it is not as high as the other two transportation modes, but I think it nicely complements the other two services. Okay, in terms of time, in terms of cost, in terms of time, the rail transportation is much faster than the sea, and in terms of cost, is much less inexpensive as compared to the air transportation. Okay, and also now if we consider the environmental benefits, we will see the rail is much more environmentally friendly as compared to the other two modes. And it provides a high degree of flexibility in changing the supply chain and distribution to the market. The new Silk Route should not be seen only a point-to-point corridor between Europe and Asia, but also a comprehensive transport network connecting numerous locations in more than 40 countries in Asia and Europe. Okay, when we look at the new Silk Route, we'll see the rail transportation play an important role in connecting all these countries, all these cities. Okay? And I'm sure you will have more detailed information from the other two panelists. Now I will pass the time to our panelists. First is the Mr. Imavelio Vander. He is the MD of DB Cargo Italy. Okay. I will stop sharing my slides here.
Thank you, Professor. Just displaying everything. That should be all right. Thank you. Absolutely right what you said. Let me also add not only about the environment. The environment is always a hot topic, and it's a very sellable topic, especially for medium-large corporations. But other benefits include also safety, especially if you compare it to road transportation. The number of accidents, the number of, let's say, damage to society is much lower with rail. And also the third aspect is, of course, not clogging up traffic on roads, which can otherwise be used for other purposes. We prepared a presentation which is in 3 parts. First, a really quick introduction on DB Group and DB Cargo in particular. second chapter on rail logistics, which I will also take care of, and then I will hand over to my colleague Tabea for the third chapter on China and the Silk routes. Very quickly about DB. DB is by far the largest, let's say, railway operator in Europe, also because Germany is the biggest economy and it is logistically in the middle of Europe, of the continent. Then, of course, because DB is a great company, enough said. Three main divisions: passengers, freight and logistics, and infrastructure. Passenger has the regional transport and the long distance high-speed transport with the ICE train that you can see, but we also have another great part of our group, which is DB Arriva, which joined the group 12 years ago and manages mainly local public transport operations outside of Germany. Then we have the freight and logistics, which is DB Cargo, which on its own reaches close to 5 billion in revenues, and that is dedicated to rail transportation and annexed services, logistics services such as terminals, such as warehousing, such as trucking connections. I will go into more detail later. Then we have DB Schenker, which is the fifth largest logistics operator worldwide. Its presence is throughout the world, and on its own revenues are in the order of 17 or 18 billion euro. And then on the third one on the right is the infrastructure part, which is in Germany mainly. And of course, it's all the tracks and the stations in Germany, the passenger stations, and also the energy transmission. Overall, you can see on the bottom part, the group is almost as big, is almost big enough to Chinese standards. It's huge for European standards, but it's almost at Chinese standards because we have almost 330,000 employees and a total revenues of 47 billion. Then I don't want to brag. You can see the positioning that we have in each market on the bottom right. Moving on, DB Cargo. So a little bit I mentioned already, but you can see here that it is a pan-European network plus the international corporations, which Tabea will describe later, especially with China. And it is roughly has about 20% market share of all European rail transports, and it is 3 times bigger than the second player. So really, really a big player. And you can see that we are present also with direct production in the dark countries on the map, which is virtually all European countries, certainly in the West. On to the second chapter, rail logistics. Firstly, I'd like to segment it into 3 main types of rail transportation. The first and most common on the left is intermodal, where by using flat wagons, you can load either maritime containers or swap bodies, which are the continental containers, or even trailers. As you can see in the picture, you have a truck directly loaded on the train. These usually go from one terminal to the other and require, of course, complementary transportation to and from the terminals. And these trains usually carry about 50 to 60 transportation units each. Then we have block trains in the middle. Block trains are, let's say, company trains, dedicated. And of course, they are also the cheapest way because you can have it directly from factory to factory or from factory to warehouse. But of course, the disadvantage is that you need to be able to afford a whole company train. So this is something that usually is purchased only by large to medium to very large companies. And then the third type is the single wagon network, which is something that we as DB are quite specialized in. And this, how does it work? We work wagon by wagon, and we use a hub and spoke system with lots of hubs throughout Europe that are connected with what we call highway trains. And then from these hubs, we reshuffle, we marshal the wagons to, let's say, disassemble one train and compose another train, so that we can either carry on to the next hub or run an antenna, a so-called antenna train, which goes to the final destination. This is a great type of service because it provides the advantage, close to the advantage of having a block train, also to customers who are not big enough to afford a block train themselves. In general, how does rail logistics work with the rail transportation chain? The three, let's say, most common examples are, you see on the graph, either you do a block train, as I was describing before, on the top from the origin right to the destination. The other way on intermodal trains is to have a road connection from the factory to a terminal. From the terminal, the container gets moved from the flat body truck to the train. The train runs, arrives in another terminal, gets transferred again to another truck, and then reaches the final destination. Otherwise, we can also do this with a non-intermodal way, meaning we don't move the box, but we move the goods. And so we basically have a very similar system by using what we call rail ports, which are road rail exchange warehouses, and then transferred onto the train, then again transferred to the warehouse, and from the warehouse onto the truck and to the final destination. And on the bottom right, you see a typical picture of a rail port. Rail logistics has been heavily liberalized in Europe. Of course, this has been done also directly, independently by some countries, such as the case of Germany, who started before Europe, the European Union imposed it. But here you see a short summary of the 4 railway packages to date, all of which have been developed in order to guarantee fair and non-discriminatory access to infrastructure, has defined the criteria for tariffs, fees, and access charges, and have also set clear rules for separation between infrastructure management and railway undertakings. Why is that? Because, of course, until a few years ago, railway, 20, 30 years ago, railway was basically managed only by the state operators in each country. So when these operators had both the management of the tracks, the stations, the terminals, in many cases, and also, of course, traction. And so with liberalization, it's very important to set clear rules, and this has worked very well and has helped this liberalization decrease costs and increase quality, and of course, all this in favor of rail, which is the most sustainable transport mode. Another mention on 10T corridors, which are very important in Europe, initially with 9 corridors, now there is 11 or 12, and these corridors have been designed as the main transport routes throughout Europe. Each of these corridors has their own committees, both in terms of infrastructure and in terms of operators, and they are important because they help the cooperation on this specific corridor without taking a general European view, but on the specific corridor, the operators discuss and also with policymakers the way to encourage their specific corridor to improve performance. And DB, of course, also for its very central position, is heavily engaged in participating in these corridors to favor rail freight. Bit of numbers in Europe. This is EU 27. What can we see from this slide? The total volumes in ton kilometers, billion ton kilometers, separated between the 3 continental transport modes: road in orange, rail in green, and waterways in blue. You see that, of course, the vast majority, over 3/4 of transportation, is done by truck, which is not very sustainable, but it provides great flexibility and volumes to customers. So in many cases, it is the preferred transport mode. But you see that also rail and waterways have a significant part. The total volumes of freight in Europe did drop quite a bit from 2008 to 2012. especially because of the financial crisis. And then they started picking up very, very nicely. Then we have another drop, unfortunately, in 2020, and this was caused by the COVID pandemic, and of course all the lockdowns which it caused. But then there was a really good bounce back from 2020 to 2021, and we regained even more volumes compared to what we had in 2019 before the pandemic. Another focus on the COVID crisis, and here you can see it specifically for 4 countries. We took Germany, France, and Italy and Switzerland, even though the latter is not part of the EU. Of course, it's central in Europe, and it is very important for, and they really believe in rail. You see on the graph, from the graph on the top left, that volumes dropped by about 4 to 6% in these countries. These are only the rail market ton kilometers, right? Billion again. You see that they dropped from 4 to 6% in 2020 compared to 2019. But then you see that there was also a big bounce in 2021, as I was saying earlier. And some countries like Italy and Germany gained 8% compared to 2019. So that's a really good increase. This also happened, of course, because with the pandemic, the road transportation was, let's say, less reliable compared to rail, because rail is usually we change drivers and in many cases also locomotives at the border, and so you remain within the same nation, whilst of course trucks tend to have an international route with the driver crossing more than one country. And with all the restrictions that we had during the pandemic, movement restrictions, of course, rail was more reliable because we changed the drivers at the border, so that we didn't have any international movements of people. And then, of course, this was the main reason why there was such a big increase, as I said, 8% in Italy and Germany from 21 compared to 2019, over 2 years. A bit of focus on the 4 countries we chose. Germany, because it is by far the largest with 449 billion ton kilometers. And you see that the rail market share is very nice at 27%, which is way above the average we saw in the previous slide at European level. Then we look at France. France has a lower rail market share, even though it is a similar size and similar shape compared to Germany. Of course, when you are transporting continentally, the number of mountains you have and the complexity of the road system or the railway system has a very big impact. And generally, France and Germany are square and relatively flat with few mountains, whilst other countries like Italy are long and narrow and have a lot of mountains throughout the country. So geography is also very important. Italy, the third example we show, has actually the lowest market share of rail, has virtually no waterway transport. And this, unfortunately, is caused, as I said, partly by the geography, partly by liberalization, which started relatively late, and partly by strong incentives, of course, to road transportation. But you see, compared to France, that even though rail market share is lower, 14% instead of 17%, the incumbent market share is lower, 46%, because even though Italy really started liberalization around 15 years ago, meaning really started, not that there were just a few new operators, but they were actually really competitive on the market. And the truth is that in the last 10 years, there has been a strong push by private operators who have also developed the market very well. And that is the reason why the incumbent market share is lower. Then we have the fourth example, which is Switzerland. And Switzerland is by far the champion whenever we talk about rail, because you see they have 35% market share. They even put it in their constitution that rail needs to be favored over all other transport modes. So they are really rail friendly. and that is the reason why they have the highest rail model share. Last slide on my side, the three key aspects which are the challenges and opportunities for the rail logistics market in the future. Firstly, automation. We do a hell of a lot of work on automation. Three examples we set up are digital automatic coupling, i.e. using automatic couplers to join and detach wagons. And also, of course, automated driving. All the tracks already have, or all the main tracks in Europe have electronic systems on the ground which communicate with the electronic systems on the trains. And of course, this is very important for efficiency and safety reasons. And in future, we are moving, such as other transport modes, more and more towards automated driving. And this will be certainly a very important aspect in the future. And also, of course, document digitalization. We try to digitalize as much as possible, again, to improve reliance and to reduce the environmental impact. Second key aspect is infrastructure development. Infrastructure, of course, is key for all transportation modes, especially rail. And throughout these years, we have all countries in Europe have invested so much money to develop tracks, to make them to have a double, triple, quadruple track, to make the length of the train as long as possible. The European standard is 750 meters, to make the profile of the tunnels as high as possible, because if you do that, of course, you can transport more goods, you can transport bigger containers and bigger trucks, and that also favors the rail market share. In the past, in the last few years, we had also, let's say, significant subsidies to boost the economy, especially following the pandemic. And now we have a lot of funds, even more than foreseen before, to develop the rail infrastructure. Of course, this also has a negative side, because to do these investments, you need to close the lines and work on them. And sometimes this causes some problems to current transports. Of course, this is all an investment for the future, so it's all extremely welcome. And then the third topic, blue on the top right, is rule harmonization throughout Europe. And this is especially important because the more we have standardized rules, the more we can develop new players, the more we can develop international players who are not only focusing on one specific countries, but maybe can cover one or more corridors from the beginning to the end. All this is aimed to boost the European policy, which of course is to decarbonize transports as much as possible. And we have the goal between the member states to reach 30% by 2030. 2030, of course, is only 8 years away, and these plans are continuously updated, but it's a very ambitious but reachable target. Thank you. That's all for my part, and I will hand over to Tabea for China and the Silk Route.
Thank you, Emanuele. I'm very happy to be able to present and share some information on how rail freight works to and from China and how Deutsche Bahn is involved with that. So in 2019, we had a trade volume between China and Europe of 560 billion euros. And that even increased in the past 2 years to around 700 billion euros. And when we look at the European economy, for example, 25% of the goods that we consume or buy are imported from China. And this is even more significant in Germany. 30% of goods do come from China. Even I have this phone here. You can see it. And components for this phone, for example, come from 30 countries all over the world. So what I want to say is we live in a world where supply chains, obviously, where global trade is intertwined, and supply chains, logistics play an enormously important role. And so the question we are asking ourselves every day in our company is, how do we shape these supply chains, and how can actually rail freight contribute to make these supply chains more sustainable and more resilient? So Emanuele, if we could hop on the second slide, which is a look into the rail freight market in China specifically. So in China, there's around also 19% of goods being transported by rail, and Emanuele explained that a little earlier. So the percentage of goods that circulate in total, 19% of that are transported by rail. And the largest commodity in China, most important commodity, is coal. Coal is as well important in Europe as a commodity for rail, because it's just large volumes that can be easily moved with those entire trains, block trains that Emanuele also explained earlier. On the right side, we go to more our topic, DB Cargo Eurasia's topic, which is the Belt and Road. So all the freight trains that go outside China, that leave China or enter China from the international market. In 2011, that was the first train from Chongqing to Duisburg, where DB has also been involved jointly with China Railways. And now the stretch of destinations obviously has developed, and I have a map that I can show later and explain a little bit more. Next slide, please. So the big question is, why should customers use rail freight? If there is sea freight, air freight, so many options. So there's three different reasons. One important reason is time. So when one container travels from China to Europe, I will always use it as an example this way. So we call that westbound in our industry. You have 2 to 3 days, obviously, by plane. You have around 15 days by train, by rail freight, and you have up to 60, 70 days by ship, by a container ship. And this is extremely interesting. For example, for the automotive industry, who need their products to arrive more quickly than 60, 70 days, for them, besides the sustainability aspect, rail freight is incredibly interesting. But there's also resilience, which has become more and more important. Resilience meaning that companies, I speak to more and more clients who have purely, for example, used 100% sea freight, and due to COVID crisis, all other major disruptions that we have lived through in the past months, they say we want to have alternatives. We don't want to only have sea freight or air freight, but we have to divide our supply chain. So resilience is a big topic, and of course climate friendliness. You have also mentioned that, Professor Liang, so that 95% of CO2 can be saved when compared to air freight, 80% can be saved compared to CO2, and also speak about safety. There's many reasons to reuse rail freight if companies want to be more sustainable. From 2011, from the first train up to today, 150,000 trains have been transported or passed on the new Silk Route. So this project is extremely successful. And now I will take a look together with you and how it actually works. Next slide, please. So DB Cargo Eurasia, the company that I'm working for, is the company that takes care of carrying containers to and from China. And so it has been, in the structure that exists today, has been founded in 2018, and we have different offices in China, in Shanghai, in Xi'an. We have a couple of colleagues sitting also on the route, let's say in Moscow and in Poland, and we have a big team in Berlin, and developed, as you can see on the bottom line, develop new destinations. So today we have Hefei, we have Yiwu, Shanghai, not only to Duisburg, but to many different destinations. So customers can use us for whatever destination their goods need. Next slide. Yeah. So I have been sometimes when I give a speech, I'm always asked funny questions. So people say, is the Silk Road finished by now? Or how do local drivers get a visa, or something like that? It's important to understand in the technical aspect of the Silk Route, or the transport of containers on the Silk Route, that there's a lot of cooperation partners involved. So there's not one train that actually goes from China to Europe, but it's more or less containers, intermodal containers, as Emanuele explained it, which are traveling from and to China. So there's usually a shipper, there's a road carrier, somebody who brings containers to a terminal. You have China Railways, and then you have, via the classical northern route that crosses Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, Poland, and then arrives, for example, to Germany or to Italy or other countries. You have a lot of stakeholders and a lot of railway companies that are involved. Next slide, please. I say there are many companies involved, but there's also technical, I would say, or specific things that are very particular for the Silk Road. For example, in all the countries that you see on this map, which are dark gray, they have something we call the wide gauge, which means that the infrastructure, the gauge on which the trains are running, is a bit wider than the gauge, for example, in China or in Europe. And that means that containers or trains that go from China to Europe, containers need to be reloaded once on the Chinese-Kazakh border, and then when they enter the European Union. So, for example, on the Belarusian-Polish border. The route that our company is using at the moment is the one that you can see in red. And at the moment, it takes around 14 to 16 days for a container to travel from China to Europe. And we can also use or connect the railways to container ships in Europe. That means when a container or more containers need to go, for example, to Scandinavia, which is an interesting market also from China, they can hop on a ship and travel to, for example, from Rostock to south of Sweden or to Oslo. So even if we say, you know, it's better to transport by rail, I think it's in logistics, it's always the most, I mean, we have to take care that we combine our different modes of transport as efficiently as possible. And that can be maybe on the very last stretch of 50 kilometers, that can be a truck, or that can be a container ship when they traveled all the way to Rostock and then need to go to southern Sweden by ship for the last couple of 100 kilometers. Next slide, please. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what Emanuele said. He explained there's different types of trains. The block trains, where we said, which are, for example, used in Europe for coal or other big commodities, companies that can afford to have an entire train for their commodity or their goods. This is obviously the large majority that runs also on the Silk Road. But nonetheless, there's also smaller companies which ship smaller quantities. And this can also be booked on a train, and this is then called FCL, full container load, or single container. So there's different options and different quantities that can travel on the Silk Road. And yeah, I will wrap it up by giving a short outlook in the future. Emanuele, that will be the next one. Of course, there's also innovation and moving ahead on the Silk Road. You have seen us explain the classical routes that go via Kazakhstan and Russia, or that take the border crossing in the north of China directly into Russia. But now at the moment, more and more customers actually get interested in the so-called middle corridor. Deutsche Bahn is very actively discussing that with partners. And that one runs via Kazakhstan, out of China via Kazakhstan, via the Caspian Sea, Azerbaijan, Georgia, the Black Sea into the port of Constanza in Romania. And then the trains are being transported by the German railways out of Constanza, actually, but by our colleagues in Romania up to Duisburg, Hamburg, or wherever they need to go. This route is a bit longer than and a bit more expensive as well, because it's longer and because you have so-called transshipments, so where the containers need to be reloaded from the train onto a ship and back on the train and back on a ship and back on the train. So that's that's costly and takes more time. But for some of our customers, this is a very interesting route to take, and we are discussing it more and more intensively with our customers. Yeah, I'm looking. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I think Emanuele and I we are looking forward to answer your questions. I think Professor. Yeah.
One question is about let me ask this first, is about the near and midterm prospective for rail service. And one audience asked about whether you can share near and midterm prospect of rail service. And also they asked about the advanced technology application in the rail daily operations, such as blockchain. I know you just introduced the automation in the rail daily operation, in the rail operation, and the audience asked about the blockchain. I'm not sure whether you have used that in that part.
Emanuele, would you want to start for the European stretch on the prospects and possible blockchain projects?
Blockchain is the hot topic, right? I mean, so quite frankly, there's a lot of applications. One of them, for example, is for tracing goods. Of course, the great thing about blockchain is that it's a trustworthy and trustworthy system. And so, for example, there have been this is not specifically for rail, but in logistics in general, there have been numerous projects also financed by the European Union, which, for example, allow the tracing of throughout the logistic chain from the factory to the final consumer, to the final distribution chain, for guaranteeing original goods, not counterfeit, right? So we still have about 7% of the products in Europe that are counterfeit. In some sectors, it's almost common. In some others, it's very dangerous. For example, in the pharmaceutical industry, there's a lot of fake products, and it can be, of course, very dangerous for the health of consumers. So blockchain is used in many different ways. I just gave one example. The first question starts prospects in terms of development of rail, right, in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as I mentioned in my last slide, I mean, so many efforts are going into rail as it is the most sustainable mode. We have continuous increases in the density of population. As in China, a lot of the population is moving to cities. Logistics and transportation in general is crucial. Public transport to avoid the use of as much as possible of private cars. All innovations, for example, in car sharing and electric vehicles. We have only a limited amount of space, not in terms of culture and in terms of things we need as a population to continue developing, but of course also roads are a limited. So everything can be done to release the stress on roads is a focus of the European policy and of course also of the different national policies. And so, as I said before, interoperability between European countries with standardized rules, more and more innovation, because of course also other transports, especially air freight and road transportation, are innovating quite a lot. We are also looking, let's say most of the main routes are, actually all the main routes are completely electrified in Europe, but there's also many routes which are still diesel, many rail lines. And so, for example, where there is no forecast to electrify these lines, it is, we're, as a sector, we're developing a lot of technology to be able to use a more sustainable combustion when the electricity is missing. So it can either be battery trains, for example, on short stretches, or also hydrogen-powered trains. And this, of course, hydrogen-powered is a zero emission. So a lot of work throughout going into making rail even more sustainable and even safer. And to persuade more and more customers to join. It is always often give the same example. The example that railway is a bit like nuclear energy. It is by far the cheapest form of energy. It is also the most environmentally friendly out of the traditional energy sources. But once you start to start up a nuclear plant, to switch it on, not to build it, it takes a whole week to switch it on. And if you want to switch it off, it takes another week to switch it off. So basically, you keep running all the time and you switch it off only when you need to do maintenance. Railway is, and therefore, nuclear energy is used to cut the base demand, right? The demand which is always there, not the peaks in the morning and in lunchtime when everybody turns on their water boilers, or EVs in the evening. So railway is very much like this. If it's used to cover the base demand, and if it is used constantly and trains are full, Monday to Sunday, days and evenings and nights, then it is by far the most successful mode. When companies understand this, it is successful, meaning that it can also be the cheapest. Of course, not on short distances. You cannot run trains normally for 50, 100 kilometers. Usually we say that the general benchmark is that from 500 kilometers onwards, the train becomes by far the winning solution. And this can be, of course, influenced by subsidies, but subsidies are only done to, let's say, encourage the boost of a sector. And when we become big enough and efficient enough, then prices will drop even further, quality will increase even more, and hopefully we will have less need for subsidies because we will become self-sustainable. I hope that answers a bit the question.
Okay. And another audience has the question about the impact of the war in Ukraine. Is there whether you, the audience asks is if other carrier has stopped their service via Russia, or whether you still keep running that route, how is the business impacted by the sanctions?
Yeah, I guess this is a question to me. I will combine both of these questions. So first, maybe one thing which is important to understand is that Deutsche Bahn is not running any business into Russia or out of Russia. That we have stopped. So the only business that we're doing in order to satisfy our Chinese and our European customers is that we run in transit. So we run via Russia, and this is also not done with like a red DB locomotive or something, but we do that with partners together. So and it definitely has affected the business. There was a lot of nervousness in the market in the first couple of weeks, to be very honest. But from an operational perspective, the trains do run very well, and so that is maybe on the side. And if you're asking yourself questions on sanctions, for example, this transit cargo that I mentioned, so sanctions do not apply for transit cargo. So if you are shipping something from China via Russia or via any territory into the European Union, the sanctions do not apply to cargo that only goes in transit. So yeah, and I mean, our focus, we obviously keep 1000% stick to the legal framework in everything we do. But we also have the responsibility, I think, to ensure supply chains and deliver the goods that our industries need. And so this is. So we decided to continue running in transit. I hope that answers the questions.
Okay. And I think your answer is, I think should be very insightful. You give provide a lot of information about that. And another audience asked about whether some kind of commodity is more suitable for rail freight transportation rather than the others less. And what's the feature of this kind of goods? Okay, and the goods transport more subject to movement stocks than what they would if transported by sea. Is that true?
Emanuele, maybe I say something about the Eurasian corridor, and then you can say something about intra-European transport. So on the Eurasian corridor, we mostly transport, I would say, so-called medium to high value goods. So very, very cheap goods, very cheap cargo usually goes with a container ship, because it's just, not competitive. It's too expensive to send it with the train. So what we would do is, for example, components for the automotive industry, a lot of like different electronics, furniture, also chemistry, some sort of chemistry. Those are goods that would run with the train on the Eurasian corridor, the Silk Route. And the other is the continued base for FCL. Yeah, so we as a company, we usually run with base for FCL. Both can be shipped. 40 feet and 20 feet containers can both be shipped. That's my answer to Erica.
Okay. Now, there was another question about
over, let's say, short. Oh, sorry, Professor.
Yeah.
So just to integrate on what Tabea was saying, of course, on the Transasian between Europe and China, there is a specific trains. There's a lot of trains running now. Many trains leaving. More than 10 trains leaving every day, and of course arriving. So that means that over 20 days there is more than 200 trains running in each direction. But of course, the capacity that the shipping companies have is hugely bigger. I mean, even if rail develops more and more, it cannot handle daily the capacity of a huge container ship, because they are reaching really. They are also getting bigger and bigger. So that makes Europe to China trade focus specifically on those items which are time sensitive or which are delicate, as Tabea said. Whilst in continental Europe, the timing is let's say similar between rail and truck, and there doesn't have we don't use maritime transportation as much. Of course, in countries that with with a long coastline like Italy, we do use maritime for national transports. But let's say we are more generic. We don't focus on specific product types for continental Europe transition. We can transport anything from, let's say, white goods to steel to cars. A lot of cars get transported back and forth around Europe with, I mean, finished vehicles, of course, for the passenger vehicle market. About 50, let's say about 50% of transport in Italy is containerized with all sorts of goods, also fast-moving consumer goods. And the biggest share of, let's say, non-intermodal transport is about 14-15%, which is steel products. Of course, the heavier the good, then the more complicated it is to transport it by truck. And therefore, that is where railway becomes even more competitive. So heavy goods, I mean steel first and foremost, but for example, construction material, for example, paper industry, the wood and paper industry. Paper is extremely high density, it's very heavy. And we developed a really good network as DB throughout Europe for serving all the paper industry. So there are some goods which are particularly favorable for rail, and because of the high density, and maybe they are less time sensitive, so they don't need to be specifically delivered exactly 12 hours from now. And if you have that kind of need, then it's of course road transportation provides more flexibility. The advantage of rail is that every train you're producing is equivalent from somewhere between 50 to 70 trucks. So you can imagine just one train running is more than 50 trucks taken off the road.
I would like to underline what Emanuele said on the quantity between sea freight and rail freight from China. So currently, the amount of the entire traffic from and to China, something below 5% run on rail. So although we should increase it, we should not believe that we can switch the entire sea freight or even half of it on rail. We don't have the capacity for it at all. But nonetheless, I think we would favor an increase.
Yeah, I think it's nicely complemented the other two modes, and also provide a third alternative, provide a lot of flexibility, I think. And
if I may jump in, just to close a little bit, because would like to catch up a little bit the question asked by Erica about 20 feet, 40 feet container, which you said both of them can be shipped to China, as well as the question about movements and shocks that the goods transported may have. Because, okay, we're coming from the ceramic industry, so we export ceramic tiles to China from Italy. Sometimes we do use trains, so the rail freight as well. But to be honest, we've been having quite a lot of issues in terms of movimentation, in terms of goods that arrived and damaged. It looks like maybe they're not fixed very well, and they are subject to maybe more shocks than what they would do on the road or on the ship. And also we've been having some issues with, for example, containers. Seems like we can only prepare 40 feet containers. Sometimes it's a big waste because maybe we do not have material for 140 feet container, but it looks like the limit is a 40 feet container. That's why probably the question from Erica was also trying to address maybe some limits or restrictions from one country to another. I mean, we've been talking about harmonization. I think maybe there are some policies there are also in place as far as what is allowed and how can it be transferred in China rather than in Europe. So maybe Tabak could elaborate a little bit more briefly.
Yeah. So to be honest, that has to be with the goods, with the damaged good, that has to be checked on a case-to-case basis. I don't have the answer to, you know, whatever, but I know that we are shipping 20 feet containers, but that can also depend on the respective province or the origin, because every province has a bit different rules and policies. It's the same when you want to import wood. People do that, importing wood in containers to China. But you can only import it to specific destinations. That needs to be checked for the 20 feet containers. I don't have the answer straight now here. But another limitation that we're facing, and we are lobbying for at the moment, is that you cannot transport dangerous goods on rail out of China, and you can do it basically everywhere else. We believe that this is something very interesting, because that taps into the potential of, you know, the automotive industry, the battery transports that we could do on rail, which we think is very interesting, also from a sustainability point of view. So we hope that there will be a shift in the near future. And obviously that's also weight limit, so it's around 20-ish tons on rail.
Okay, since we have already run out of time, there is a final question. Maybe we can probably answer to Damian via email, if that's okay, because we really need to close. So I would like to thank once again all of our panelists today. Thank you for this very interesting webinar. We enjoyed very much, and as I said at the beginning, we will send the link to the recording of today's session to you. So I wish you a nice evening or a nice afternoon, depending on which time zone you are right now, and thank you once again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.